Hello, everyone. How's it
Hello.
going? Welcome to Solar Storage Fest. Thank you so much for joining today. Sorry for being a little late on the session. As all things go, there's always some technical difficulties, and but we're very excited to be here at the first session for Solar Storage Fest. Thank you all for being here. We're currently working now on getting our other guest speaker, Karl Popham from Austin Energy on, so hopefully he'll be on shortly. But we wanted to go ahead and get the show started, as I know all of you have been here patiently waiting for several minutes. Again, welcome. My name is Jason Rodriguez. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Zpryme. We're very excited to kick this session off today. And here is Mr. Popham now. Just in time, Karl.
Glad to be here. And is my mic okay?
Karl has been our guinea pig probably more times than he can count on things, and we appreciate you kind of being one of the test bunnies of a Solar Storage Fest in terms of how we troubleshoot technical difficulties in this new world.
I was good. I just kept logging on as you, Jason. So I was just bumping you off. So I was ready to MC. I was going to tell the panel we're changing up all the questions and we're ready to go.
Sounds good. Well, sounds good. Well, welcome, Karl. Thanks. Glad we have everyone on, and we'll go ahead and jump right in the first panel of the day. Key tech and trends shaping the next decade of solar and storage. And today our special guests are Judy McElroy out of Austin, Texas. She is the CEO of Fractal Energy Storage Consultants. Welcome, Judy. We have John Freeman, and he is the executive director of the Great Lakes Renewable Energy Association for Michigan. And again, Karl Popham out of Austin, Texas. He is the manager of emerging technologies and electric vehicles for Austin Energy. And Angel Lance out of California. She is the CEO of Motive Power. Thank you so much. And feel free to put your questions in there as we go along, and we're going to try to make enough time to get to them at the end. So I don't need to explain to this audience the challenging times we are in. But we do want to dive in and get some feedback throughout this conversation about where we are going and what the challenges that lie ahead, but also the opportunities that lie ahead, and what our experts today see, not just how we can address some of those problems, but also what are those opportunities. So this first question I'd like all the panelists to chime in on. And so Judy, I'll start with you. Within about 60 seconds, what do you see as the biggest challenging facing this clean energy revolution, and maybe energy storage in particular?
Yeah, I'll probably always take the path of energy storage, since that's my particular niche of understanding. But I think the same can apply to any type of clean tech in the industry. A lot of these technologies, like energy storage, they're very difficult to understand. So when you have utilities that are having to go out and make it all work, there's so much talk about all the value that some of these technologies can bring to the table, but it's really difficult for utilities to understand, okay, I understand that they can do all these different things, but what can it do for me specifically? And then even if they can get through that stage and figure out the value proposition that is inherent to their organization, it's about taking that value proposition and translating into something that can be procured and contracted for very favorably. And that's a very difficult process. There's also a lot of supply chain issues in the marketplace. There's uncertainty in the business models. So for example, a particular business case or an investment may make sense today, but that can look entirely different in 4 or 5 years. But at the same time, we're on the rope because we have to plan projects for 20+ year project lives. So, there's a lot of risk and uncertainty in understanding what that business case may look like tomorrow. And then finally, the political climate, the impacts of federal, state, intermarket policy can really accelerate, or it can really dampen the opportunity for storage and other types of distributed energy resources.
Thank you. And John, biggest challenge you see?
The Great Lakes Renewable Energy Association is comprised of businesses that install solar and geothermal energy systems, primarily for homeowners, small business, and farmers. The biggest challenge we're having in Michigan is that the utilities understand large-scale solar. They can incorporate that into their business model, but they still feel that small-scale solar is a threat to the monopoly business power. And so they're doing everything they can to try and undercut the economics of individuals and small business and farmers installing a solar system. So I think it actually, for solar storage, I think the future is going to be pretty good, but in a backhanded way, because as net metering comes increasingly being undercut, that more and more people will see that by incorporating batteries, the extra solar electricity that used to be exported to the grid will now make more sense to store it in a battery system, so you don't ever export energy back to the grid, and you just use the extra energy in your batteries either to charge your car or to enjoy your household needs or your small business needs in the evening hours as the sun goes down. So to summarize, the biggest challenge is the fact that utilities don't seem to understand yet that the environment is changing and that they have to change their business model, because inevitably, if you continue to alienate small-scale solar interests, they're going to find a way to reduce their costs, and incorporating batteries will be that way. And ultimately, that means for the utility, it's one less customer who is not going to be participating all that much with the grid, and also the cost of supporting the grid.
Thank you. And Angel?
Well, I think John just stole my thunder. And I think that's pretty great because he's on the other side of the country from me. And so I'd like to echo much of what he just said, but from the other side. And as a testament to really what utilities and the solar industry are sort of how they're colliding. If I feel our biggest challenge is really getting utilities to understand that the landscape has changed. It maybe changed a while ago, but it's certainly changing more formidably right now, and it's not going to go away, right? The needs for solar, the needs for storage, the needs for individual, residential, commercial, business storage needs are only going to get more and more and more in every part of our country and actually across the world. So I see the biggest challenge is really getting utilities to understand their place in that shift, and what solutions can be had that work for all.
Thank you. And Karl?
Well, I work at a utility. I'm the only utility representative here. So I can only talk to Austin Energy. There's over 3,200 entities that make up the U.S. electric grid. And maybe that's one of the challenges right there is the lack of really a national program or strategy. When you're dealing with 3,200 entities, you have different regional ups and downs. So here at Austin Energy, I mean, we're, I think by any metric, very pro-solar. Our generation fleet is over 40% wind and solar today. We have very aggressive targets in the near future to get us to zero emissions by 2030 with our generation fleet. So we also have very what I would call generous rebates for residential and commercial rooftop solar. We have over 3,500 customers and growing that have taken advantage of that rebate. And I think we have a fairly generous value of solar program, just under 10 cents a kilowatt hour per produced on that. So I think it's really about, but in some ways I don't disagree, is on what some of the core challenges are. And one thing we did with Austin Shines is a sustainable business model. Where is the triple win? And what I call the triple win is both for the utility, for the grid operator, and for the customer. And that's really what the Project Shines we're doing, is to achieve that triple win. Where does it make the most sense?
Yeah, Karl, you touched on Austin Shines, so I'll throw it back to you on there, because I think that's a pretty innovative project that really the future we can build off of. Can you maybe tell the audience quickly about what that is and some of those use cases you guys were looking at, and how can other companies and utilities learn from that project?
Well, certainly. And I think this example of Austin Energy being really forward thinking in storage and solar. So what Shines is a very innovative project with support from Department of Energy and State of Texas. It's a collaboration that built grid scale, commercial and residential energy storage solutions paired with PV solar. And then we also introduced multiple business models where a lot of the utility-led programs are direct utility controls. We have direct utility controlled assets, as well as third-party aggregators and autonomous controls. We did value review of 19 value streams. We field tested 6 to determine what is the most value to the customer to achieve that triple win. And I'd say the key lessons learned is, I mean, one is it's all up and running. It's met all the grant objectives with DOE. I guess that's lesson number one. Also, I'd say when you approach these kind of energy storage pairing virtual power plant technologies, is have the end result in mind. Is this a increased renewable energy play, or is this a resiliency play? You kind of have to understand the difference. And what we found is East Coast was more about resiliency. West Coast was more about renewable penetration. We went down the path more of renewable penetration. Look at the policy barrier. So here in Texas and ERCOT, one of the biggest value streams for the utilities, congestion cost reduction, or what we call 4CP. There's a cap of 1 megawatt or more. You're not going to get that value as a utility. So if you're in Texas and under the ERCOT market, which is basically all Texas is, my advice to you is create systems that are 0.99 megawatts. So you can get the value of 4CP. More than that, and you're not, based on a policy barrier. And then I guess lastly is the what I'd recommend or lessons learned is one, and this is another barrier because we have so many different regions and cities that, and this is similar to solar as well, is understand what the city codes are for implementing energy storage. So when we started Shines, there was no city code to address commercial storage. And then so when the codes and fire department code enforcement you looked at New York that says we don't want any storage in the city, and then you look at West Coast California. Well, we're very open. Let's get as much storage as we can. We ended up developing codes which were somewhere in the middle as part of a Shines unintended deliverable, but kind of know what your regional is, and that's a barrier. And lastly, on just the importance of open standards, we saw much more value. The fact we started day one with open standards. Anytime that started breaking down, we saw not just the technical solution silo, but the value stream silo. Once you had a player that tried to capture that and in their own way of thinking.
Thank you, Karl. So Judy, I'll turn it over to you because I think Karl touched on several use cases for energy storage. You work on several projects across the country there. So what are you seeing the impact on storage? Where does it go from here? And maybe how has it impacted some of your portfolio of storage or maybe the partners you're seeing?
Yeah, and just to emphasize, what it is I do, we're an independent consulting and engineering shop. So we're not actually a developer or an owner or a seller of storage projects, but we do play an integral role in helping projects go into the ground properly. Some of the biggest things, I was trying to think about how I could maybe rank these in order, but I think they're all pretty equally important. I'm going to have to say that the biggest things that impact storage deployment and renewables deployment is going to be policy. So federal policy, state policy, and then, down in the market levels and the ISO or RTO, which are the entities that basically run the grid. On the federal level, it's about whether or not the current investment tax credit or ITC is going to keep going. Right now, it's set to phase down over the next 2 years. It already has phased down to 26%. Next year, 22%, and then finally after that, 10%. And there's still this hope that maybe with an administration change that it would be elongated or even possibly rejuvenated. And there's some interesting legislation that's been floating around because of the current state of the economy. There's this bill that's been in the House called the Moving Forward Act. And it's really a very heavy infrastructure bill about building highways and infrastructure, but it's really earmarked. If you dig down to it, it's really earmarked with incentives and investment for things like renewables, electric vehicles, and energy storage. And just about a month ago, they pegged another bill to it called the Green Act. And again, it's all about just support of renewable energy. So it's kind of exciting. And then similarly, there's been a lot of legislation proposed. A lot of it's been tabled, but it's still going on whether or not energy storage should by itself qualify for the ITC. And that has been an interesting debate. And honestly, I've been kind of pessimistic because, I know that storage isn't generating electrons like renewables are. But, given the current climate, because of the economic depression, because of COVID-19, given this new imperativeness because of climate change, I am becoming a believer. I think that we may see some new incentives come out for storage or extension of existing incentives to include storage. And then, some other things that we saw this past year would be President Trump's executive order that was back in May. It was called Securing the U.S. Bulk Electric Grid or something like that. And this kind of is, a lot in line with the war on China or vice versa. And it basically has caused this massive scrutiny on any type of products that are going into the bulk electric grid. It's really focused on transmission connected projects for large generators. It's caused utilities to put projects on hold or to add a magnified level of scrutiny where you want to know where your parts and pieces are coming from. And people are taking a big step back from products coming out of China. But I hate to break the news to everyone. Every single battery cell comes out of China. And I don't care what people read or what they think or what they've been told by some internet blog. Every battery cell, whether it's mega factory, gigafactory, or whatever, it's being made in China and it's being shipped over here. Maybe it's being packaged over here. But it's really hard to break ties with China when everything is coming from there. And then finally, we've seen a lot of FERC orders like FERC 841, FERC 845 that really removed a lot of the barriers for storage. But the problem is it's really taking a lot of years to roll out these initiatives. Most markets are, all the way up to 2024 with implementing a lot of these FERC rulings. And then finally, on the state level, we've seen a number of states come out with energy storage mandates. As of this year, there's a total of 7 states. Back in 2013, California was the first, and then just now in 2020, Virginia was the most recent state. So a total of 7 states that have energy storage mandates. And if all these mandates, once they go in, that accounts for about 11,000 megawatts of energy storage. And so this policy, whether it's federal or state, is really turning the wheel on investments and installation of energy storage. And then finally, there's just a lot of activity in the market level. So here in Texas, we call it ERCOT, but there's other markets outside of our state borders, and they're all finding their own ways of changing rules and protocols to deal with things like distributed energy resources. We call that DG or distributed generation here in Texas. And then also with hybrid energy storage resources. John mentioned that earlier, things like solar plus storage, whether they're AC coupled or DC coupled. There's so many things that need to happen, barriers that need to be removed, and rules that need to be changed. So that way these resources can really realize the opportunity at hand.
Thank you. And Angel, John, I will come back to you on the policy side, but I want to get Angel in on this conversation a little bit to talk about California and also putting your hat on as a customer, having an off-grid home. Do you think the customers are more pessimistic or optimistic about new technologies for the home? What are your thoughts there? What do you see in California?
So I think people are far more optimistic than you might think. California, as Judy mentioned, has led the way in a couple of different areas around solar, people having solar on their roofs, and around mandates around storage. And some of that has had to do with climate change. Some of it has had to do, with fire season and that sort of thing. But a lot of it has to do just with sensibility. For example, I was talking to a friend of mine the other day around what's going on with solar installations. And here's what they had to say. They're talking about half of California, 45% or so, have solar on their homes. And now when they're being requested for new installations, almost 80% of customers that they have are requesting battery storage, either grid tied or off the grid. These are existing customers or new customers. There's lots of reasons as to why that's happening. COVID is a big factor, but it's not as big a factor as grid reliability and power shutoffs during fire season. Folks are feeling with COVID a bit of vulnerability to keep their households running while they may work there, or they may have an elderly person or someone who has machinery that needs to make sure it's reliable. Folks are moving rapidly towards storage. It makes a lot of sense, right? Because if you have solar on your house, it makes more sense to go find some sort of battery backup or storage for reliability than it does to buy a generator. Right? And if you've already invested in your house or you're intending to invest on a solar level, then the next easy step for reliability and then potentially independence is to move into solar storage. Right? So it's sort of a natural inclination. So I'm very optimistic because not just residential installations, but commercial as well are seeking both of those elements. They're seeking reliability and they're seeking independence. So and COVID has somewhat inspired more of that, but because people are home more, their energy usage is much higher than usual. They have kids at home often, and they're managing school and 5 people on a computer with video and all sorts of things like that. And so their attention is drawn more to their ever rising utility bills. Both from a customer perspective, like me, but also from a commercial perspective, where you have to maintain things like business continuity. You need to maintain connection with your client base. You need to maintain a lot of things that you need to make sure are reliable. And folks in California are really spending a little more time making that happen on their own.
Thank you. And John, I'll turn it back to you now in terms of what policies or programs are you seeing in the Midwest that we should keep an eye on, or maybe that we need to the industry needs to get behind, and maybe who are some of the folks leading those conversations, whether it's companies, nonprofit groups, or utilities?
Well, I think you can break down the policies into 2 categories. There's been a ton of press this week about what's happened in Ohio and Illinois, where legislation was enacted at the state level, prompted by bribes and use of dark money in order to pass legislation to prop up nuclear power plants that are essentially stranded costs and are no longer can compete on an open marketplace against the low cost of renewables. And so, have, basically twisted arms and used a lot of money to make that happen. In Michigan, we don't have that problem. But in Michigan, as I said earlier, the problem we have is that we're grappling with the fact that utilities are able to incorporate utility scale solar, but we're still trying to figure out, as Judy mentioned, about the distributive generation tariff. The interesting fact, though, is that right now we're going through the final Public Service Commission process for consumers' energy, which will be resolved by the end of this December, to determine what the new distributive generation tariff will be. But we have another law in Michigan that goes back to 2008 that limits the number of small-scale solar to 1% of the average peak of the major utilities. So by the time the DG tariff is going to be determined by the end of this year, we're probably going to reach that 1% within consumers' energy's jurisdiction. So it's going to be a moot point. And then what the utilities are suggesting is that rather than expanding the 1% cap or eliminating it, they say they will still connect small scale solar systems to the grid, but they're only going to pay avoided purple costs, which is around 3 or 4 cents per kilowatt hour, or they want to pay locational marginal price, which is again 3 or 4 cents. So they're continually trying to discount what they're going to pay for energy for people that export energy to the grid. The other challenge we have in Michigan is that we don't have a community solar statute. And so for the chunk of people in Michigan that would like to have solar, but live in a condominium or live in an apartment or a house doesn't face south, they're currently out of luck right now in Michigan. So we need to make some fundamental changes within our state laws to really facilitate the expansion of solar and, geothermal as well. And I think that, I think it's becoming a bipartisan issue because, again, a number of conservative legislators as well as, people out there, they want to have a choice. They want to have a choice whether to continue to buy energy from the utilities or whether to install their own small scale system. And the final irony is that even though Consumers Energy and DTE are embracing, large scale solar, their energy rates for residential and small commercial keep going up every year. So even with the incorporation of renewable energy at the large scale, their rates are not coming down. And so that just feeds into the interest of residential, small business, and farmers to trying to take control of their energy expenditure by installing their own solar systems so they can understand what their costs are right now and what they will be for the next 15 to 20 to 25 years. And so those that kind of a potpourri of challenges we have in Michigan and the broader Midwest in terms of stranded costs of the nuclear plants. And one of my final comment on this question is one of my big concerns is that, and I'll use DTE as an example, they're currently building a monster natural gas plant, but that in fact may become a stranded cost down the road as, again, renewable energy keeps decreasing in price. And so once that becomes uneconomical, DTE may come back to the legislature or the Public Service Commission and want a bailout bill for this natural gas plant. And so, we need to see some changes within how these utilities are operating. And we need to understand that as the other guests have mentioned about the overall large picture of what's happening as we move forward.
Thank you. Some good points. And,
Jason,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So I think that, and this has nothing to do with what John said, but to me, this is something that I kind of took away from it. That I think that with the general public and even mine, there's this romantic idea that every time we add another solar panel or another wind turbine to the grid, that we're starting to displace fossil fuel generation. But that's not the way it works. And I could kind of talk about maybe Germany to this extent. Germany, you'll see Germany in the news and talks about how, Germany is hitting this 95% penetration with solar and maybe they're kind of doing it for maybe a couple hours of the day here and there throughout the season. But the dirty secret of all this is that the fossil fuel generation is spinning away in the background. And guess what? So as renewables go in, yes, the renewables are cheaper to some degree, but now the ratepayers are paying for the renewables and they're still having to pay for the spinning thermal generation in the background. So you now have two layers of capital costs and operational costs that you need to pay for. And the reason being is because solar doesn't produce all day long. It's intermittent. Wind doesn't produce all day long. And even if you add storage into the mix, it's just not available enough to be reliable. So that's really the thing that I hate to be a party killer here, but that's something that we have to acknowledge and be aware of and communicate with to the public is that we are trying to go green, but we're not kissing the thermal generation goodbye. We need it to keep the lights on.
But with all due respect to Judy, a couple of comments. DTE and Consumers Energy are systemically shutting down coal plants in Michigan, and they're ramping up on the renewable energy. Consumers have actually gone a step further. They announced literally a year or so ago that not only are they not going to build any more coal plants and they're going to shut down coal plants, they're not going to build any more natural gas plants, and they're going to replace all of it with renewable energy and storage. And so I think there's a fundamental sea change, and I give consumers some credit. And the other thing we have to understand is that Judy's absolutely right about the sun doesn't shine all day long and the wind doesn't blow, but wind tends to blow in the evenings overnight, and solar tends to obviously work during the day. And so there you can, with a smart grid And with batteries and the sophistication, I'm sure Karl can talk about much more professionally than I can. I think there is a way of balancing it all out with renewable energy as you shut down coal plants, and as you're not even, in the case of consumers, building any natural gas plants to replace the coal plants.
Right, but two things. So the more renewables that go in, the LNP prices get suppressed. That means energy prices and payments go rock bottom, and that essentially puts the thermal generators out of business. So yes, utilities retire their units, especially the old ones with a really high heat rate. They're losing money, and some are losing money really bad or worse than others. But what happens is instead of keeping those plants gone, something similar like in California happens. So California is shutting down all their thermal units, and instead they're importing fossil fuel generation from across the border. So they're just, some areas are getting rid of their thermal units, but then they're getting the fossil fuel from somewhere else. So I just want to point that out, that it's just the fossil fuels will not go away anytime soon. And I just, it's just something that we keep sweeping it under the rug and we pretend that it doesn't exist. And I love renewable energy and I want to be clean and green, but I also like having the lights on and I like my air conditioning, especially since I'm down in Texas. So how do we deal with that? And I think the best way of dealing with it is being honest with ourselves and acknowledging that this is what's really happening.
And I think I'll just add just a very quick technical notice. We talked about nuclear, natural gas, and then renewables, so solar and wind. And from a technical aspect, right now, where we are today, they all have their place on the generation mix. It's trying to figure out how much and how quickly can we get more to, our end goal is zero emissions. Zero emissions by 2035 is actually a goal right now. We're at over 60% today in our generation fleet. And so you mentioned nuclear is great for base load, and no one's building a new nuclear plant that I know of in the US. But there's still assets out there and it's great base load. It's just on and it's always staying on. And then you have natural gas, especially the newer ones, especially around peaker plants, can really help supplement until we have widespread affordable storage. Peaker plants, which is basically airline turbine engines turned 90 degrees, you can turn them on and turn them off very quickly. So they help supplement the grid as well. And then the renewables, we are seeing a really good buyer's market in renewables. We do see that if you look at the Austin Generation Plan, that is the pathway to our growth. And the price keeps getting lower and lower due to economies of scale. But even with renewables, then it's diversity in grid scale versus commercial versus residential, distributed versus grid. And even when we look at assets, where it is in the state, the wind profile on the coast is different than the wind profile in the crest zones in West Texas. So to the point earlier, a lot of wind does happen at night in the crest zones, but in coastal wind, there's a lot more happening during the day. So we even try to balance how we purchase and where our wind farms are, even regionally in the state, to once again get that diversity of that portfolio. So you're playing to the strengths and not putting all your eggs in one basket, which is kind of our strategy today.
I love that, Karl, because I as Judy was talking, and I agree with much of what she had to say, and John as well. I just sit here thinking that, 125 years ago, utilities solved some pretty major problems. They brought energy to people's homes. They brought energy to people's businesses. They brought them across the United States, and they brought them across the world. That is not a small feat, right? It's a big deal. And I think that they are uniquely situated to be able to find, and I love you use this term, Kyle, the triple win, right? Utilities, yes, there are problems with renewables. Yes, there are problems with storage. Most importantly, there are problems with policy. But innovation is what drives policy, right? Rarely does policy start and then drive innovation. It doesn't usually go the other way around, right? So I think utilities are in such a fortunate position to be able to unite, to integrate, to be able to tackle the problem of green energy across our country. Because as you mentioned, there's different parameters in each state, different parameters in each area. And nobody knows the business of utilities better than utilities. And so now is the time to band together and innovate and drive that policy so that we can solve these problems. They're solvable.
I think Angel's right, but I think we need to break out the different groups of utilities. I think the investor-owned utilities operate completely differently than the munis and the co-ops. And what I find is that the investor-owned utilities are all about trying to preserve their business model, trying to get the 10% profit, on investment and make Wall Street very happy. So it's not clear to me that they're going to support innovation unless it supports their bottom line, which doesn't necessarily correspond to helping ratepayers out necessarily. And that's why I think it's very important for the public service commissions of each state, as well as the legislators, to help oversee as they're supposed to, but in some cases provide legislation that does drive policy. Because in Michigan, there was no solar in Michigan. That legislation started the renewable energy movement in Michigan, and so now we need new legislation to promote community solar, microgrids, and other kind of innovation techniques, which the investor-owned utilities are flat out opposed to.
Thank you, John. I think you all guys, thank you for diving deep in that topic and chiming in. We have about just under 15 minutes left, so I want to talk a little bit about solar for a little bit in terms of the challenges of community solar, rooftop solar, and the different policies out there. And I'd like to start with Karl. There's actually a question too from the audience. I'm not sure if you see that, Karl, on your panel about how Austin Energy treats rooftop solar, but because you've been involved in projects trying to shape these different models, what do you see, and maybe take into context what John said, how municipals have a chance to treat these things differently? Is that business model that works? Is it the community scale? Is it large scale? Your guidance there?
Well, the short answer is yes. So it's really what you're, so we do have several community solar projects here in Austin, the most recent one called La Loma Community Solar over in East Austin. And so once again, you look at, what was the goal? So to John's point, the goal is over 50% of Austin lives in multifamily. They might not have that rooftop, but they still want to participate in local solar. And so that's what La Loma, and then there's another asset on Palmer that has those programs. It was also important to us is everything we look at looks at a lens through equity. So a major chunk of La Loma is reserved for low-income families. And not only do they get a good rate that locks them for up to 25 years, they get this flat rate for 25 years if they stay in the program. So you kind of have to look at it that way. We also do big grid scale stuff as well, both solar and wind. And then, something I heard, and then for residential and commercial, we have very generous rebates and I think a generous value of solar program. But to, John was saying something earlier that kind of resonated with me, but it had a slightly different spin on it. He was talking about choice and choice between, using a utility or just, self-generating. We're big fans of choice as well here in Austin Energy, but it's really choice of program. So if you come into Austin and you become a customer, even though Austin is a city-owned municipal utility, there's a lot of advantages on that by having very long-term. We've been doing this business model since 1895, so it works for Austin by having a very long-term view on our customers. And so it is, okay, well, do you just want to use regular electric grid? So that today, looking at the numbers, 63% today is carbon-free generation if you just do nothing. You want to support 100% today? Well, you can order Green Choice. It's a very small premium, but now you're investing in 100% West Texas wind is now powering your home. Are you interested in an EV? Do you have an EV? Well, we can pay for half of a level 2 if you want a level 2 charging. If you want to participate in a pilot called EV360, you can have a fixed rate, all the charging you want at home for $30 a month, plus all the public charging. Or if you don't want home, do you want to do $417 a month for unlimited public charging at 1,000 ports backed by West Texas Wind, once again. So everything, you just kind of go down the list, and it's just all about just a myriad of choices, whether you want to generate yourself, community solar, invest in grid, all that choice is relative to the customers when they sign up or just want to make a change in their lives at Austin Energy.
Thank you, Karl. And Angel, I also want to come back to you. There was a comment also in there about California mandating net zero construction, and you talked a little bit more about some of the costs coming down and making these products more accessible. With regards to those policies and the adoption from a consumer standpoint to the average consumer, Is that something you still feel strongly about, or some of these products still just available just from a cost perspective, available only to a certain segment of customers?
Yeah, so I live up in Northern California where we've had lots of fires and they've burnt down town. So there's a lot of people rebuilding homes. And that has generated some interesting new topics. One is messing around with insurance, which is kind of a new thing for a lot of people. I mean, yeah, you have insurance on your house, but you really hope you never use it. Like, that's the big thing. So then when you have to use it, you need to learn about a lot of different stuff, like building code. With the rebuild of the house that suffered through the fire, California has instituted a code that mandates that you'll have solar on your house and an option for storage. They do not mandate storage at this point, but they do mandate solar. So then, well, what does that mean? I mean, maybe you've received some insurance money to rebuild your house, or maybe you're remodeling, or who knows, maybe you're looking for solar.
Angel, I'm sorry. Can I interrupt you 1 second? I think John's typing on a typewriter as you're speaking. I don't know if everyone else is hearing that, but I'm getting a very loud distraction. I'm trying to focus.
I'm
on
sorry.
And do that.
I thought I was
That's
supposed
all right.
to answer these. I thought I was supposed to answer these questions.
Yeah, you can't. You can't. No, you can't. I think if you mute your mic, John, you should be good. I thought it was.
Yeah, it sounds like you're on an old school typewriter. I mean, it is loud, at least in my earbud. I apologize. Go ahead.
Thank you, Karl.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So I was just talking about what's reachable for the average household. So pricing for solar has been considered expensive for most folks. So I started talking about the insurance thing and the rebuild thing because it's actually being wrapped into various elements of everyday life. I think it's somewhat of a myth that solar and storage is unreachable for the average home. For example, you can get a grid backup system for as little as $10,000. And now there's new programs involved that you can do it yourself. You can DIY or DIY it to install it, cutting that cost in half. Now, people spend significantly more money than that on their car or on their grocery. I mean, like on everything, like a regular everyday life demands more capital. So it's really not out of range. That particular system I'm talking about, the one I purchased for $17,000, and that's an off-the-grid system. So it's solar as well as storage. Now it's on a small scale. It's not large, but if you wrap that in with a home loan, or you wrap it in with a monthly payment plan, you can often cover that off inside of a year or two for the average household. Maybe longer. If you're on a low income infrastructure, then maybe it might take you 5 years. But nonetheless, you can still do it. And what's the advantage? The advantage is that your utility bills are continuing to go up. And if they're continuing to go up anyway, and you offset the costs of where they're headed and where you think they're headed with your investment now, it's really quite manageable. From a residential level. On a commercial side, with some of the tax credits that Judy was talking about in California in particular, there's some real incentive there to make some changes, not only from a reliability standpoint, like I described before, or an independent standpoint, if you wanted to maybe be on that side of the coin, but also just from a tax management perspective. I think that there is enough out there to motivate folks to not just take this seriously and desire it, but to shift the market dramatically. And therefore, I think it's something to really pay attention to more now than ever before.
Thank you. And Judy, I saw a question here from Andy Lee, and she was just talking about we don't have enough bandwidth. She's saying that it may take another 10 to 15 years to put enough energy storage out there. Energy storage is getting cheaper. Is that something you can chime in on? You agree with 10 to 15 years to get there?
Uh-oh, can't hear Judy, or I can't anyway.
The price is getting cheaper, and as a result, what is assumed to happen?
Oh, okay. I think I missed that, but what is
the question?
Oh, it said much like the internet in the 90s, we simply don't have enough energy storage for the time being. It may take another 10 to 15 years to put enough energy storage. It will happen anyway because the battery is getting cheaper and cheaper.
Yeah, back to what Karl said earlier, there's never going to be so much storage on the grid that everything works great and the fossil fuels go away. Storage is going to be just one slice of the pie chart indefinitely. We're never going to get to a point where there's so much storage that all the problems go away, or that we have full reign on putting in 100% renewables. Yes, the price does keep coming down, but incentives go away. So, one thing I mentioned last year at Solar Storage Fest is that, putting in storage today with taking 30% ITC on the battery, it's going to be the same 5 years from now when this ITC goes away and prices come down. So the next 5 years is kind of stagnant. Nothing's changing. The prices of the cells keep coming down, but the prices of the racks, putting the batteries in the racks, that's not coming down very quickly. You're not buying cells, you're not buying modules, you're buying racks of batteries, or you're buying fully integrated containers. And then there's a big difference between the cost of a battery cell versus the cost of a rack or a system and how that comes down. Labor rates keep going up, EPC costs keep going up. So, the cost of the cells, I can make the same argument for like the cost of solar panels. People think that just because the cost of solar panels keeps coming down, that therefore it's cheaper to put in renewable energy. But there's so many elements that go into the costs of deploying a project. So there's the cost of the generation piece, but then there's the cost of the actual deliverability, the cost of transacting power from one place to the next. There's the cost of the ancillary services, the grid balancing. So there's a lot of things that come into play. So yes, prices keep coming down, but and maybe it does open some doors up for some of the business cases that have not reached parity yet. But it's not coming down quickly enough to be a huge game changer in the near future.
I just, with all due respect to Judy, I often caution against using the word never, because never implies that everything is stagnant. And the one thing is absolutely clear in the energy market, it's anything but stagnant. The market is driving this revolution on energy. Certainly, there's a lot of concern about climate change, and which is justifiable. But the market is doing more to reduce the cost of renewable energy and doing more to encourage corporate America to switch from buying energy from fossil fuels and natural gas to renewable energy. And so I think there's a whole lot of we were in the relatively early stages of this. I mean, modern storage just came along with Powerwall, and right before that, we were still dealing with lead acid batteries. So, and that was just a couple of years ago. So I think there's going to be a lot of changes, a lot of dynamics. I think the price is going to come down. I think there's going to be a lot of research and development, which is going to promote even more changes. And I just think there's a whole lot of speed and momentum picking up to try and change it so we can get the energy we need in order to power our air conditioning, even in Texas, but we can do it with clean energy, and we don't have to make that trade-off anymore between getting the energy we need and sacrificing the environment as a result.
Thank you. We're down to our last 2 minutes. So I'd like to have Karl just give me your final thoughts on where's the optimism there, and Angel, and then we will wrap this engaging panel, which I think could have gone on for the whole day.
No, it's fun. We actually had a fun. Normally, I'm gonna confess, I normally don't like the practice calls because we're just practicing the same thing. But I love the practice call with this panel. We just had a great discussion. We saw a little bit of that today, maybe being a little more guarded since we're live and recording. But the thing that drives most of my optimism, quite frankly, is when I speak with younger generations. I do help. I'm a guest speaker at our local university, University of Texas, and several things. And just hearing the commitment and the intelligence of our millennials and younger, that gives me the most optimism. And I also see, to John's points and Judy, I'm seeing market drivers being very positive moving forward. It is a buyer's market in a lot of these renewable energy products, at least here in Texas. And then lastly, we continue, even during COVID, we're still seeing a big push in transportation electrification, electric vehicles and bus transit. If you really want to clean up emissions, it's just not about the electric sector. You have to get into the transportation sector as well, and seeing a sustainable pathway is there. And since we're talking storage, we've talked nothing about really stationary storage. 80% of all storage is going to have wheels attached to it in the near future by even modest projections. So incorporating that storage as an asset, taking that sunk cost, that storage for that car, and incorporating that into vehicle to grid applications, which we do have. Vehicle to grid is part of Shines. We've also done V2 applications as demand response for vehicles as well. There is a lot of capacity and opportunity in that market. I'm very optimistic. Maybe I'm just an optimistic guy. I mean, even during the middle of COVID, I'm optimistic. Sure.
Thank you. And Aaron, Angel, Aaron had a few remarks she needed to make, so I think I'm getting the signal here. But I want to thank all of our panelists. I think we kicked it off great, even with some hiccups. So Aaron, all yours.